Kia ora tātou nau mai, haere mai. Good morning, my name is Sharon Lloyd. I'm the General Manager of the Circle here in New Zealand. Welcome to today's virtual briefing with the Circle with our guest of honour, Frances Valintine, of course, CEO of Tech Future Labs, as well as many other things, Director, Thought Leadership, Futurist. Today, as well as sharing more on the theme of the series of resilient leadership, Frances will talk about looking up from the current challenges and how do we need to reinvent ourselves now. Of course, an increasingly important conversation in the current environment. I want to thank our sponsors of the series, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, IBM, Red Hat and ServiceNow. Amazing as always to have your support to take this series to the world, and we appreciate you sharing our ambition to keep everyone connected during these uncertain times. As always, I think you're used to the feature now. We have questions that can be submitted through the Q&A of the Zoom feature. And there's also the option to upvote any questions with the thumbs up button. And with Frances today in the conversation is our moderator, Azura Fernando, Chief Design and Technology Officer at IBM New Zealand. Izzy, welcome back. Great to have you with us again. And I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thank you so much, Trans-Tasman Business Circle. I'm totally delighted to be here. And thank you to everyone who's signing on to this webcast. Really appreciate that you've taken the time to spend with us. And Frances, thank you for giving up some of your time to have this very empathetic conversation with business leaders from right across New Zealand and Australia. Look, Frances, you're someone who needs no introduction. You know, high-tech Hall of Fame. You sit on a number of boards of business organizations. You've chaired New Zealand, the Ministerial Digital Inclusion Group. You've co-founded two very successful organizations, MindLab and Tech Futures, and you've been recognized with the New Zealand Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit. But the thing, Frances, that I really enjoy when I have conversations with you is this ability for you to take a subject matter, look at it from a very broad context, and then just distill it in a way that makes it very easy for us to understand your train of thought. And I think that'll be the theme of how we have this conversation today. And of course, for everyone on the webcast, please don't hold back your conversation, your questions. Feel free to ask them at any point. And between Frances and myself, we'll weave them into our conversation. So thank you very much for that. Look, Frances, these are certainly trying and uncertain times. I struggle to recall a time where New Zealand has really been challenged in this way, and I think now more than ever, not just the New Zealand community, but the global community must really come together to face what it is we're facing now. And the question really that has been on the minds of every business, every government, every family, and every Kiwi has been, what do we do now? And so, how has Frances Valintine answered that question? What does she do now?
Look, thanks, Izzy, and thanks for the intro as well. This is an extraordinary time, and everyone's feeling it slightly differently. And I've been reflecting a lot as somebody who works with organisations planning for the future. I can honestly say that we were planning for things like the impact of climate change. We were thinking about, even to the point of some biological warfare, what would that look like? We've talked about supply chain risks. We've never talked about pandemics. And I think if I'd gone back into any of my governance roles in the last year and said, hey, look, we should be planning for the whole world to be shut down, borders, trading to stop, people to be locked in their homes, I would have come across as crazy. And to be honest, it was so far out of what we imagined. We knew off the backdrop of SARS 18 years ago of what impact that had within a number of Asian economies, but for somehow we never really extrapolated that and said, what would that look like in a New Zealand context? And so the part that is we had almost no time to prepare, even though we started to see things roll out. Our ability to plan in such time pressure is very limited because we just don't have that experience to fall back on, and that has been a massive challenge.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And how do you think leadership has changed, and how do you think it should change, taking the shutdown of everything into context?
If I go back just a couple of weeks ago when we first went into lockdown, there was a very different conversation I was having with CEOs who were very focused on the here and now. They were acting in what do we do today? And actually there was a little bit of disbelief that this was going to be something that wouldn't be resolved quite quickly, and that they were thinking about, we'll ride through this period of change and then we'll get back to business as usual. Mm-hmm. That conversation moved pretty rapidly from thinking about how do you minimize this and have the least amount of disruption in our workplace and and the way we operate, to actually thinking about, this crisis has happened. Mm-hmm. This is a point in time forward that is actually everything needs to be re-looked at, and now we're planning much more decisively about what the business model looks like, what leadership looks like, what does talent look like, what does the workplace, work model, working hours, connectivity, infrastructure, like almost every part of business is now being turned upside down. Mm-hmm. And I think that so the conversations are much more around the world ahead looks very different than the world we knew.
So Frances, as a CEO yourself, what does that look like for Tech Futures Lab and the other businesses that you're CEO of? You know, how much of that was you looking at the present, the now and here, and how much of it was you consciously, purposely building up a culture that was ready to pivot and change and adopt new business models? What did that look like for Tech Futures Lab?
So we were in some ways very lucky because we're an information-led organization. So data is incredibly important to us. So we have people who are constantly looking at inputs and insights. Mm-hmm. And so as we started to see the impact out of Wuhan and going into Europe of COVID-19, we started having conversations with all staff about what that would look like. And we did a whole lot of scenario planning. So how would we run our organization? How would we look after our customers? In our case, also students. You know, we have postgraduate students who are studying with us part-time and full-time. We also have a number of business clients who needed access. So we went into scenario planning very early on. So by the time we went into lockdown, we actually had that planned out. But we also had the technology to enable that to happen. Mm-hmm. What we suddenly appreciated is how few people were really in that scenario. That even right. with great insights, they were often very tailored to their sector and not necessarily thinking, well, if we can't get access to our supply chain or procurement, or if we can't use our normal systems, that actually is a tumbling effect. Mm-hmm. And so the end-to-end sort of ecosystem, if you drew it on a continuum, you'd start to see the fragility of multiple steps along that journey. And I think that's where people operated initially in the, let's figure out what we do today, and the shift across. And so I think planning is going to become more and more important over time. And I think we're going to learn a huge amount from this experience, and particularly around data. And what's been really encouraging in terms of politically, and the decisions that were made were informed, 100% by data. There's, that we're actually starting to make sound decisions based upon the best possible insights that we can get. And I think we're starting to see it with medical advances. We're starting to see it with people making choices. And I think that coming out of this, organizations who haven't been data rich and really utilizing big data will start to really embrace that and understand the weaknesses they have if they don't do that.
Right. Look, I really agree. I think an organization's people and talent are really their core assets, and that's what really separates out good organizations from great organizations. And with Tech Futures in particular, you have some of the top talent in New Zealand, and you've built a team of them around you. The office spaces that you have are so conducive to open collaboration. I've visited a few times, as you know, Frances, and it's such an endearing place for the exchange of information and ideas. How have you taken all of that culture that you've built around a physical space and taken into this modern digital space?
Yeah, and interesting enough, actually talk about our space, we actually moved out the day, like 4 hours before the lockdown started, because we'd actually signed up for a sort of a bigger, newer space just down the road. And so suddenly with 48 hours notice, we had to pack up a building because it was going to happen a few weeks later, and vacate, which was an interesting time. And so actually now we're in between spaces, so that when we move back into the ability to access our building, we'll be between finishing off a new building and vacating our old one. So we're going to live virtually for a little bit longer. But the reality is the connection with people is very strong. I think we've all learned these types of platforms like Zoom are incredibly good in terms of equalizing everyone's contribution. You know, there's nothing worse than in the good old days where there's 6 people in a conference room talking and 1 person on a video chat and is sort of in the background trying to wave to get attention, and they sort of get forgotten. I think when you bring everything together, whether it be an executive team, a whole staff, could be in a governance board, actually it's incredibly sort of the equality that comes when people can have this sort of type of dialogue. And I think one of the things around the tools that we've always had access to, or when we say always, the access to this type of technology is very low cost and very accessible if you understand how to use them. And what it's doing, I think now, is it's driving other behaviors coming out of COVID-19, because now we've got people who have never shopped online are shopping for everything online. People who have never gone to the doctor and had a diagnostics or diagnosis over their phone call or a Zoom call are now doing that. We've got people who have never watched streaming media or they've never watched a Netflix series suddenly binging on it and realizing the flexibility that having those sorts of media platforms provide. And education is the other one, which I'm very close to my heart, which is taking experiences which were limited to some to actually being accessible to all. And the amount of learning that's out there at the moment, that's been some of the best institutes in the world and the best think tanks in the world have opened their doors, so to speak, and are sharing openly across these global audiences, talking about this world coming out of COVID-19. It's been, quite exhilarating.
And how and I'm sure the folks on the webcast are keen and eager to know how easy or frictionless was it for you and your team to move from the delivery model you have now to this new business model of everything online?
To be honest, we did have a massive advantage because we've been doing a lot of delivery online historically. So that previously it was part of our delivery just so we could reach right across the country, but also across the world. And our first postgraduate program, we delivered the night of lockdown online. Oh, so wow. We were, it was sort of baptism by fire for us. And actually what's really interesting is, for example, if we talk about education, our postgraduate programs, so these are long-term programs, so, could be up to a master's level, which might take up to 1.5 years. We have had more enrollments, but for example, a program starting today has almost twice the enrollments we would have normally, typically in a normal world pre-COVID. So the appetite for learning for professionals, who is the only people we really have as students, are typically people in a profession, mostly in their 40s and 50s, has never been higher. And I think what's happened is people have, in having that time to sit back and reflect about how they're working, what they're thinking about their employment, what they're thinking about their purpose and their vision and their views on what they're doing. There's been quite a lot of people thinking about what skills they not have. And I do think that learning is going to kind of start to underpin as people start coming out of lockdown, but even more important is as the economy has to have a kickstart, education is going to have a greater focus than ever before, particularly around digital transformation and actually the ability to be able to work differently going forward.
Yeah, and I agree. Learning and education is something close to my heart. And, I think we know that, women in general and minorities are still vastly underrepresented in STEM education and careers in New Zealand. Do you think there'll be a groundswell and uptake of the underrepresented in education?
It's strangely for us across our organisation, we have a higher participation of females than men across all of our technology programs, which is always a nice anomaly. But also, if you're looking at the information coming out of schools, and the Tertiary Education Commission did a big study just a few months ago, looking at young children under the age of 13, girls completely outnumbered boys in terms of their interest in STEM education. I think it was almost the ratio of 2 to 1. So I think the tide is changing, but we also have to understand that when people talk about STEM, it's not just about sitting and programming, it's actually much broader than that. And the project management and actually looking at the integration of technology into analog businesses and trying to digitize. There is almost every role now has got an element of that, and it's really trying to amplify what skill sets you need as things evolve.
So that's so refreshing to hear. And I think in a time like this where people are concerned about, job safety and security, and I think a lot of organizations are mindfully looking to reskill and cross-skill their current employees and deploy them out to different areas of the business. What do you think organizations could learn from how yourself and your team have deployed these learning modules? Any tips for the folks out there?
Look, I think there's a lot of organisations who don't fully appreciate just how much learning is available now, both in New Zealand and offshore. A lot of it is free or very low cost. When people talk about online learning today, they're not talking about a self-paced, almost like a workbook online. It's very much an integrated, facilitated delivery, not dissimilar to what we're talking about here.
Okay.
You have the ability to break out into rooms. You can facilitate. And we're even doing design thinking and design sprints online now, with people sort of stockpiling things from their home and actually running group sprint sessions. You don't need to limit it to just a sort of a talk fest. I think the other thing is, within environments, it's letting people have the opportunity to learn. And if I was to think about some of the things that will come out of this very strongly, will be businesses needing to digitize. So if they haven't already, all of the trends that were already underway, I think it's fair to say coronavirus has put an accelerant under them. Anything that enables you to virtualize things, so whether it be the process of automating processes and systems, whether it means you could sign up for documents, hold an event, do things that actually perhaps do not need to be done in person. I think we should expect that more and more people will say the things we do in person have to be really meaningful above what we can do online. And so it will change a lot of interactions in many fields. I think also, if we think about the agility, that once you are digital, you are given this agility which we now need in our organizations to respond to change, because this is not going to be, certainly not the first, but it's certainly not going to be the last need for us to do a massive rethink about our economy, our society, about our teams, about our futures, and not just through a lens of short-term survival, but actually long-term. How do we reorganize ourselves so that we can actually edit out things that no longer are important? Our businesses have a lot of functions which need editing out, but actually legacy holds them tight. And I think people have seen, there's all these discussions around how much COVID-19 has been the accelerant of digital transformation. All the things the CTO wanted to do for 10 years are now happening in a period of 2 weeks. And I think that motivation and ability to sort of break the rules and permission to do things has now got people thinking about digital in a very different way, and the ability to evolve really rapidly. So, it's not a fixed state that we're in. We need to constantly look at adjacent organizations and industries to say, who's doing this best? What can we learn from them? How have they pivoted? How have they taken on customers and onboarded them? How have they retained customers? How do they keep engaged? And actually, so, you might be looking at, for example, online media or a Netflix model, even though you might be in retail. You might be thinking about procurement, but you look through a different lens of an adjacent industry and start to understand. I think customization is going to become really important too. So learning can also be talking to people and teams saying, okay, right now you may not be as productive as you have been because business is quiet, but let's look at how do we customize our offering, our services, our products, so that we can tailor them to more people, and also making sure we retain customers. So we need to make sure we never incentivize staff to be idle, because idle people get very dissatisfied very quickly and very unhappy very quickly. People like to be productive. So I think it's taking this opportunity to keep as many people as possible employed and active, and of course learning.
Yeah, and I agree. As humans, I think we're genuinely wired to be challenged continuously. And I think that's when we thrive. But, you've spoken about, these changing business models, accelerating a digital agenda. Do you not worry that perhaps the digital divide that we have here in New Zealand, do you not worry that it may grow with folks who have the luxury of time, or have the luxury of some downtime perhaps, or even access to high-speed internet to consume this content, versus some of the other folks that are providing some real essential services? And I'm talking about the folks that are delivering our groceries, the cleaners who are keeping us safe out there, some of the medical folks that are, wheeling us in and out of the hospitals. Do you not worry that we may cause a larger digital divide here in New Zealand, Francis?
Yeah, I think those two topics need to be decoupled from each other, because obviously there is no doubt that the frontline workers right now are the saviors of the time. They are, they are our heroes. And I think that we should never take our focus off that. And I would really hope that we recognise that people in the medical profession, in the teaching profession, and people who are working in logistics and transportation and courier drivers and actually are recognised at the other side of this in a way that they are contributing to our society in a way that is far more valuable than they get the recognition for. And that would include scientists. I mean, one of my great dreams is that scientists will come out of this looking like, the good guys, they're the ones who have the answers, because the solution out of this, and from a medical point of view, will come down to science and innovation. And so we can't lose sight of the people who are the heroes today, but the heroes of solution are also people who are often unrecognized for their contribution. So I think that's important as well. The digital divide, I think for a lot of it, comes down to the confidence people have to learn new things. And as a country, we are working constantly to remove the divide that is connectivity and access to hardware. Now, that's certainly still a long way to go, but we're in a better position than most. And we do have, the majority of people have access to smartphones. We still have some connectivity gaps. So let's not put that as, hide that. But I think one of the challenges of the country, you may have heard me say this before, we have the lowest participation in professional development in OECD. So once we get in, out of our undergrad degrees and a bit of work experience, very few people go back into formal learning. And so that means there's actually the cognitive process of learning is like any part of your body. It needs exercise. It needs to be constantly challenged. So if you stop, it's a bit like if you don't go to the gym for a long time and you stop, the idea of going back to the gym feels like a divide. If people have stayed a reasonable level of fitness and suddenly they decide they want to do a half marathon, it's not an impossibility. What we need to make sure is we don't just put people into a camp and say, well, they're part of a digital divide because they're an older group of people, or because their job is not very digital, or they've never used cloud-based technology, or they don't understand what Slack is. I think, there is a sort of a huge assumption. And I know at the moment there'll be a lot of people who will be taking and screen sharing with their parents and trying to get them onto technology like Zoom, or getting them connected. And once they're there, the confidence built up and they continue on. So I am very much of the view that we need to make sure that we bring people on that journey, because we're not going to go back to analog. The ability to be confident and competent with basic digital skills is essential. And I think that that's going to get amplified over the coming weeks and months.
And I think it really that's a really key point. I think it seems almost impossible long term that the world as a whole will go back to what it was before. I think this is going to bring about a new norm, not just for how we work, but just how we interact with people and socialize. And there's a question here that asks, what do you think are the number 1 to 3 optimal things, so very specific, Francis, optimal things New Zealand as a country can do to reset, collaborate, and reboot for this new normal?
So I think one of the things that we have historically done very well is innovate. We haven't been the greatest innovators for the last 10 or 20 years. And in fact, it's much harder to find those uniquely world-first innovations coming out of New Zealand in recent times. And where we are doing great things typically is around software. One of the things I think, if you look back on other crises in the world, and if you go back to, say, World War II, there was a raft of invention and innovation that came out of that. And the crisis means people were having to solve for bigger problems. I would see coming out of this a really great focus of people starting to put more into R&D, starting to collaborate more and cooperate more, potentially with competitors for survival. And through that process, actually finding other common threads and actually going into partnerships. I think we'll start to look at talent differently as talent starts to think about how they want to work and how they want to contribute within organizations. And actually, if we start to think about the way people will come together to innovate through this crisis, other innovations will come about. So I think as an optimal, number 1 would be, we need to look at risk and think about, we're not going to be in the state of just constant growth anymore. We can't do hockey sticks predictions. We can't talk about, returns to shareholders and dividends. We're going to be having to think about risk, saying, if we just continue the way we are, we're in big trouble. So the only way through this is through research and development, collaborations, cooperations, and actually taking away the guards of risk so we can move forward. So I would say that would be the first one I would really focus on. I think the other thing will be, hopefully New Zealand has the benefit that we have got some privilege in terms of timing. We may be one of the first nations who can get to the point where we can operate fairly freely within our own nation if border controls and we get under control of COVID-19. That gives us an advantage very quickly, that we can actually start thinking about what do we do really well that we could do better? What could we scale up? And one that comes to mind, for example, is we feed 30 million people currently globally every year, but actually we have the land, the quality of our, of our pastures, we have the infrastructure, we have the people and the capability to scale that rapidly. So what if we wanted to feed 100 million people a year? What would we need to do? What innovations would we need? What technologies would we need to implement? What type of capability would we have to bring to the table of traditional primary producers so that they would be able to do that? So I think it's recognizing this combination of skills of people who understand how to scale things and how to take what we're good at already and turn it into something that we're even better at. And I'd really hope that would be a key outcome from this. And we have to do it fast. I mean, we don't have 10 days to plan at the moment. We're having to think on our feet, because actually every other country, every other market is trying to think about how they come through this. And there is going to be a number of casualties of industries who don't move fast. Because actually with innovation rises, you're going to, startup communities will start to innovate in different ways. They'll see opportunity, they'll spring to life. And I think particularly if there's going to be some initiatives around government investment, there may be a catalyst for even greater change and innovation. And the innovation that may happen may come from your competitors or organizations who haven't even formed yet. And I think that's a really critical one.
Right.
Sorry.
No, please.
And I would say, well, then third and probably last is that consumers have been given this sort of massive opportunity to try and taste what a digital world really looks like. And so everyone should be looking at their business, their sector, their position, and actually starting with a blank piece of paper and pulling it all apart and saying, which function have we not digitized fully, or are we not giving a streamlined, rich, rewarding experience? And it could be the procurement of a customer, it could be retention of the customer, it could be servicing, it could be the way that you're communicating with them, it could be pricing, it could be just whatever part of it. And I think that there are some sectors where, if you think about the event sector, right now with a very shaky few months or years ahead, they're having to think about how do you turn the richness of a digital experience into something much bigger. In the last few weeks, I've attended musical events and festivals. I've done art galleries. I've done Frank Lloyd Wright tours of houses. I've done all sorts of interesting things online, which I could never normally do. And they've been really rich and rewarding in experience. So then you start thinking just one sector is going to look different. What will sports stadiums look like? Or what will festivals look like? What will it look like in retail? Obviously another sector to be dramatically impacted at the moment. But in my case, education is going to be turned inside out, because if you go back in 6 months and start continuing on your economics degree, of what relevance is that going to have if it hasn't pivoted and contextualized 100% in today's world about what economics will look like going forward and not what happened before? So everything is shifting.
Right. And so Francis, so maybe a bit more of insight. So not only are you CEO, but you hold some leadership positions in several New Zealand organizations in terms of being a director or a member of the board of, there's Watercare, there's the Dilworth schools, you're board member of Callaghan Innovation, you're an advisor to the Edmund Hillary Fellowships. What are some of those conversations that are happening above the CEO level with these boards, Francis?
So I think boards more than ever are recognizing they have to get out of the way of really competent leadership teams who are, they are solutionizing, in some ways finding right now solutions to keep things functioning. But at the same time, they have to still have an element of oversight because of risk, because now risk is even at a higher level, because actually there's the risk of business survival, but there's also a risk of things like health and safety, risk of staff and mental health. There is a risk that comes down to this huge financial risk. And they're all very different. I mean, if you are a significant person who, for example, if I look at the Dilworth, they own a lot of property. Their fund and their trust is through property. And so now as a landlord, when everybody is potentially unable to pay their rent, the trickle-down effect is that the people can't pay their rent, then they move into this mode where the trust doesn't have as much money, and that means the operation of a school can't function at the same level because they don't have the same level of money coming through operationally. If you're looking at infrastructure organisations like Watercare, obviously have much more complexity about making sure we have safe water, and they have to operate through all situations. So theirs is business as usual, but actually a higher levels of elevation, and we've got real complexities. And in the media, we'd already have seen things like people putting a lot more wipes down, flushing them down the toilet, which is causing these blockages, which is causing more call-outs than ever before. But also we have no rain, which is creating other dramas on top of one crisis. And then if I look across organisations and advisory roles I have, and you mentioned one of Edmund Hillary Fellowship, which is the global impact visa of people coming to New Zealand to look at how they can create communities and elevate kind of talent capability. For example, aerospace is a really strong connection within Edmund Hillary Fellowship, attracting people who are really interested in aerospace. So we've got Rocket Lab, who've kind of been the catalyst of change, and now it's bringing people and attracting people through. I think what we're seeing more than ever is New Zealand is becoming extraordinarily attractive. I'll give you a quick example. A couple of nights ago, I was on a call, and it was a call on the future of humanity. 200 people from around the world. For me, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, so I wasn't on my best form, but I was happily listening in. And one of the questions was, post-COVID, where in the world would you most like to live? Now, I was the only person from New Zealand on the call. The host was in Portugal, so there was a number of people from Portugal. So the first up was, I want to stay in Portugal. The second most popular place people wanted to live, at least 200 people by far, was New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
And it was just this constant, just a stream of people coming through on chat saying New Zealand, New Zealand, New Zealand. And I think, we have at the moment this ability to actually redefine and recreate what it means to be human in this new world. So this is not through a socialist lens. This is not through just a sort of a slice. It's not political. It's about saying, how do we learn the lessons that we have? Do we all need to be traveling into the city or into our towns for 40-hour working weeks and peak traffic? And when suddenly people saying, well, actually, I quite like this ability to work from home. Maybe sometimes. Do I need to work 5 days a week? Maybe not all the time. We will have to think about how do we kickstart our economy, and I think it's going to change some really big conversations about what it's worth in your role and what purpose do you have. And when I'm in these conversations, humanity keeps coming up. You don't normally enter a business conversation and suddenly find you're pivoting and talking about economics and humanity in the same conversation.
Right.
And actually, I think that's the really interesting thing that's happening, is people are not. It's a bit like the decision. You don't put the economy over lives of people. It's a natural no-brainer. Lives come first, the economy comes second, and most of countries and most economies in the world have taken that track. But actually, this kind of connection between those two, that humans coming out of this will be different. And actually, we have to think about what that looks like and how they want to work with us, the types of organizations they want to work with, because they've gone through this collective crisis. Right. There has never been a crisis where the whole world is feeling it to the same extent as this one, particularly in modern times. And so that's driving a systems change. And so that systems change is going to manifest itself in many different ways that we can't predict right now. So we can only do it by watching very closely, listening, but also using great data.
That is so heartening to hear, that a business conversation had a theme of humanity. And I suppose it's obvious, and it became obvious when you mentioned is that, at times like this, it's imperative that the interest to serve society should take a priority over business self-interest, right? And I think more so than now, and you said it before, Francis, we can't really, this is a global phenomena. And here in New Zealand, we can't really stand alone outside from the rest of the global community. And there's a question here that asks you, Francis, about, with your international exposure, how do you think Kiwi businesses are responding in comparison to our peers offshore? And might there be something different about our Kiwi culture that enables us to do this better?
I think, as I mentioned before, when the interest in moving to New Zealand was so profound on this call, and what I think people are seeing is this lens of, we are already reinventing the wheel. I mean, economically, people normally don't know who we are, but they know us for a whole lot of other reasons. They know us either from a tourism campaign around pure New Zealand. They know us because of great movies. They know us because we've got lots of sheep, but increasingly they know us because actually we have got a humanity. We've done some extraordinary things. I mean, if you think off the back of the crisis, that sort of, I guess what we've experienced in the last year between the mosque shootings and White Island, and then the effect of the bushfires very recently, we're starting to understand that actually at the end of every day, we go home to our families and we're individuals. We've become part of a community, and our community is a part of our neighbourhood, and our neighbourhood is a part of us, it's our, how we operate. And I think New Zealand's getting very good at amplifying what we do on the world stage as a sense of community. And we're quite coherent. Our willingness and preparedness to sacrifice not going to work, I think has really shone a big torch on us, and saying, why have New Zealand accepted that in such an early stage where things were still reasonably under control, but actually our compliance was very high. And I think that's showing certain characteristics about us that are just reinforcing what people are hearing about us as a country. And I do believe that's where it comes down to, we will get to redefine what New Zealand wants to be, because we're small enough to be able to kind of recreate the model that we want. But it's going to mean us not to ever think about, well, let's just get back to normal. Because I think that would be my greatest fear, is that we come out at the end of this and we haven't learned what people really want. And I think that if you think about a very simple example, there's been an element of the person we present ourselves in the work environment and the person who we are at home is often completely they're totally separated. Now we've invited people into our homes, we've got our pets running around and our kids on our lap, and we've got noise in the background, and actually we're starting to see each other much more beyond the person we see in the office. And I think that's just a small step in this idea that people are one. We are more than what we are at work. But that creates a psychological change in people, where they start to realize that they can be one. They're not just defined by what they do during the office hours.
Right.
And that will get people thinking about what they want to be. And I talk about this as the midlife crisis for business, because actually,
how do you mean midlife crisis for business? This is fascinating.
When people have a midlife, often middle age, what happens is we have this crisis about, oh gosh, half my life is sort of gone, and what have I done? And I've also maybe put too much focus on things that weren't that important, or people who weren't really important, or I made too much of an effort to do things that really didn't bring value or enjoyment to me. And now in my second half of my life, I'm going to focus more about things that are really important to me and my family, and be thinking about things that make an impact in my legacy, and what I want to be to my kids or my grandkids, or what's it going to be like in New Zealand in 100 or 200 years. We start thinking about where we are. So for me, COVID-19 is like a midlife crisis. It's like suddenly saying, why are we doing this? Like, what are the sum of all the parts that we have, and what things are actually really important? Like, how much stuff do we do because we sit and push things around in a meeting, and we push things out into the system, and the system provides, and we come back and we do all over again? And how much of that could we strip back and actually get better understanding of what we really need to do, and what is the biggest priorities, both in business and our lives? And they're big conversations.
Yeah, and something you said earlier about spending more time with people and inviting, the work persona into your personal persona. That I often worried about what this screen was going to do with the relationships and the culture we've built at work, but also I have with the clients and customers. But it has been I find a lot more intimate because you're invited into people's homes. You know, you get to see pictures of the family, you get to see things that they're doing as a hobby, and you're getting to know people. And so it's really interesting and fascinating how, although there is a screen that separates people, you are kind of almost being invited into this other world that you didn't really know existed. So
yeah, what I think is so delightful is we're having time for long format conversations. You know, we've been talking in sound bites to each other for so long because we're in an office and we're just like, it's back to back. You know, we have this kind of like overcommitted diaries. We never have long conversation. It's like next to the next to the next. And actually now we're having conversations, not just with the people who are in our businesses and our customers. We're actually having conversations with our families probably more frequently and longer. The number of people now who are probably having, you know, daily check-ins with their parents or their cousins or whoever it might be, and particularly those overseas, which under a normal world would be really hard to do. And one of the wonderful things about being human is long format conversation. You know, so intimate conversations with people where you have long, you know, an hour to talk to someone as opposed to a flashing few minutes. And actually what that enables us to do when we think about our customers is this is a great time to talk to customers, to ring up and say, hey, you know, let's just talk about how we work together, what would make things great for you, what could we do differently? And I think we could utilize this time to have lots of learnings which are direct from long conversation.
And look, Frances, whilst there's been a bunch of questions, and I do apologize to all of you, there have been so many questions coming through, all high quality, but there have also been, Frances, some really good feedback coming. One of them I'd like to read out that says, thank you, Frances, for so clearly articulating your beliefs, insight, and perspective so heartfully and inspirationally. So thank you so much, Frances.
That's lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so you know, we've spoken about so many things. We've spoken about, you know, the need for speed. We've spoken about businesses maybe even competing or reinventing themselves with other organizations that haven't existed before. We spoke about humanity and kindness and placing human life and value before the self-interest of organizations. If you could leave the conversation and emphasize a few key things to the folks that are listening to you now, to maybe provoke them to think a bit differently or inspire them to think more collaboratively, what might that be?
I mean, I would always will say we underestimate how much we can learn. That this is a great time for learning and actually finding information of things you don't know, have deep understanding of. There is, you know, so I think about this as like a mini sabbatical. This, you know, a time for reflection. I know a lot of people are working extraordinarily hard, but you can't sit at a screen for 8 hours a day. So you know, take those breaks out and really think about what you want to have a better understanding of. And it could be psychology, society, it could be artificial intelligence. I just think it's one of the key things. And actually don't plan for when you go back to normal. Plan for a better future. Plan for a better normal that actually is more inclusive, more equality, but also really defines New Zealand and what we want to be on the global stage.
Frances, you know, at some point, I kind of forgot that there were a bunch of other people and it felt like I was having a one-on-one conversation. Thank you so much for breaking down your thoughts and ideas. I really appreciate it. And for all of you on the webcast, thank you so much for participating and making this feel as normal and natural as possible. I think, Johnny, you might want to, do you want to say a few words just to wrap this up?
Thank you, Izzy. Yeah, we always like to finish on time. And it's my pleasure to firstly thank Frances. While I'm thanking her, we have our business sentiment poll, 4 questions that we're asking you to fill out quickly so we get a mood of the audience, and we'll have those answers in a moment. Frances, thank you so much for joining us. You know, your career covers portfolio career, full-time education, business, and above all, the heart. And when you talked about humanity and you talked about the essence of Kiwi approach to life and us being a magnet for people who want a better place in the world, such as those on your call the other night, is a real endorsement of where we can lead the way, not just follow. And your discussion on education and training and really the democratization of how these are opening up as imperatives for all of us, I think are lessons that should invite people to get up and actually go and learn and take advantage of the opportunity. We'll ask you to have the last word in a moment, just looking at our poll results. in keeping with your philosophy, you'll be proud, 50% or more, I feel not just challenged, but innovative. And we're thrilled that over the last 2 weeks, that's been a predominant view. And fortunately, relatively few people are scared, but we're certainly up at the innovative consistently over the 2 weeks. The governments in both countries are doing a great job, and this is again very consistent. And everybody's kind of picking the 6 to 12 months, with 12 months being quite dominant. And we're thrilled that today's event met your objectives. And Francis, thank you for contributing so much to that. Final word now to Francis and to Izzy, thank you. And to our partners, CBA, IBM, Red Hat, and ServiceNow. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for making this series possible. Francis, the last word. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just really want to say thank you for everyone who participated. This is, it's an important part of your day as well. And it's a great privilege for me to be able to talk with you. And I really hope that you'll find great strength out of this crisis, and you'll come out of this feeling like you can really make great positive change in your world. Thank you.
Thank you.